Hello, everyone. Thanks so much for coming today. I'm Rochelle Diamond, and I lead our employee experience team, and I'm responsible for the LinkedIn Speaker Series. So before we get started, I always like to remind everyone what our LinkedIn Speaker Series is all about. As many of you know, we've been doing this for a couple of years, and we've had some incredible speakers. We had Sheryl Sandberg, Deepak Chopra, more recently Reid Hoffman, Seth Meyers, Gretchen Rubin. And really the goal of this program is to expose employees and members to innovative thinkers and inspiring ideas that will then in turn make you more productive and successful. So one of the other important things about this program is that it really reinforces one of our core values, and that's relationships matter. All of our speakers have come to us through our employee connections and referrals. So I also want to take this time to remind you, if you have any suggestions, preferably it helps when there's a connection involved too, but let us know about it at go/speaker series. So now onto our special event today. As I mentioned, this is all about innovative thinkers and inspiring ideas. And we're incredibly lucky today to have two of the most innovative thinkers in the area of startups and entrepreneurship here with us today. And I know that it's going to be a very inspiring discussion. I'm going to give a few words about each of our speakers today. First of all, we have Reid Hoffman, a man who really needs no introduction, but I'm going to give him one anyway. Reid is the quintessential entrepreneur from when he started the first socially oriented site, social.net, which was actually before Friendster or Facebook, onto his business development days at PayPal, and then obviously onto co-founding this amazing place where we all are today. He's currently a partner at Greylock, which is a top venture capital firm, and is one of the most successful angel investors in the Valley with some amazing investments like Facebook, Zynga, Airbnb, LinkedIn, of course, just to name a few. As you may also know, he's a really thought leader in this area. He co-authored the book Startup of You, which was about how to really have an entrepreneurial mindset to be able to transform your career no matter what your profession. And recently, this past summer, he co-authored a Harvard Business Review article with Ben Casnocha and Chris Ye, and it was called Tours of Duty, Tours of Duty, the new employer-employee contract. And Reid's been very interested in this topic, and it's all about recruiting and managing entrepreneurial employees. So that's some recommended reading for you guys, Tours of Duty, Harvard Business Review, and Startup of You. So Reid, thank you so much for being here today and for interviewing Eric. Thank you. Now on to Eric Ries. Eric wrote the book, The Lean Startup, and he's been a successful entrepreneur ever since his days as an undergrad at Yale, where he co-founded Catalyst Recruiting. He went on to continue his successful entrepreneurial career, where he started a couple companies, There.com and ImView, and just to name a couple. And now, if you read his LinkedIn profile, you'll know that he works full-time with entrepreneurs of all stripes, really trying to change the way startups are built. His lean startup methodology has been written about in many publications, Wall Street Journal, the New York Times, the Harvard Business Review, many others. He has a successful blog, Startup Lessons Learned, and he's also a proud LinkedIn influencer, so be sure to follow him on LinkedIn. Eric, as we mentioned before, we bring in speakers that are through our employee recommendations. And I just have to tell you, you've been on the top of our list for a very long time. And it was clearly demonstrated when we sent out the invitation. We had an overwhelming response right away. We actually had to do a seat lottery for the seats in the room. So I speak on behalf of everyone when I say we are just thrilled that you're here. So thank you so much for coming.
Thank you.
Yeah. So now Reid and Eric will have a discussion for about 35, 40-ish minutes or so, and then we will be opening it up for Q&A in the room and also on our internal stream. I want to remind everyone that you can tweet and share content. Our hashtag is InSpeaker, and their Twitter handles are up on the wall over there, at Reid Hoffman and at Eric Ries. So with that, Reid and Eric, thank you.
So if we haven't embarrassed you enough already, in order to begin, we also gave everyone a copy of the book
as part of the
thank you.
As part of
the
this.
Lucky lottery winners indeed.
Yes. Despite the fact probably most folks are familiar with it, why don't you start with the kind of a précis of the lean startup methodology? Just a few kind of what you think over the 5 bullets in quick hit, so that we bring everyone to the same page.
Sure. First, I need a disclaimer, because I've been suffering doing this a lot from resume inflation as I get introduced more and more frequently, and I start to be retroactively declared to be more successful. The word failure was not used in my bio at all, which makes it entirely inaccurate. Most of the companies that were just name dropped are not successful companies. So listen, for the record, Reid is a successful entrepreneur. I'm just learning how to do this. Okay, just for the record. And it's important to answer your question, because the reason I got into doing this, I'm an engineer by training. I grew up, you got to picture me like the nerd in the parents' basement programming computers. Like, I thought I would be doing that my whole life, my whole career. I got into this totally by accident, because most of the products I have done engineering on in my career are even today not used by even one person, even though they had highly scalable architecture, if I do say so myself. Never had any scalability problems, so it was great. No problem. I did my part. But the customers didn't actually show up. And so what I wanted to try to figure out was, how come the best practices management tools that I had been taught as an engineer, that my colleagues who had gone to business school had been taught in their MBA program, and just that everybody knew to be true, produce such consistently bad outcomes when you put them in startups. And so the very quick idea of Lean Startup is that entrepreneurship is the management discipline that deals with situations of high uncertainty, when we don't actually know what's going to work in advance, which is very different than a regular job at a regular company where you're working on version 27 of something that has been proven to work and needs to be incrementally improved. And in that situation, all of our normal tools of management don't work very well, because we can't make accurate forecasts. We don't know who's ahead of plan, who's behind plan, because the plan was totally made up. And so if you buy into the idea that we have this high uncertainty, then it makes sense to say that our #1 goal in a startup situation is to try to reduce that uncertainty through learning, what we call validated or scientific learning. The best way to do that is to run experiments, so science, it works. And since we are in a time-limited situation, and in a for-profit situation, in a competitive situation, it makes sense to run those experiments quickly. So one way to think of Lean Startup is a methodology for rapid experimentation to quickly discover what is and is not working. If you discover that something is not working, you get to my most overused piece of business jargon, which I am responsible for, the pivot. I'm sorry. But you cannot understand startups without understanding this concept that you have to have fidelity to the vision always, but you have to be willing to change strategy if the strategy is not working. That's a pivot, a change in strategy without a change in vision. And so that defines what the purpose of our experimentation is to try to figure out, is our strategic hypothesis correct or not, as quickly as possible. And then all of the other jargon that people will have heard about related to Lean Startup are just tools to try and do that faster, like the minimum viable product, the smallest version of the product necessary to start that cycle of experimentation. We call the iterative process we go through of running experiments build, measure, learn, adapting ideas from lean manufacturing. That's why it's called Lean Startup, to optimize for cycle time and batch size, as well as continuous deployment, split testing, a bunch of other more technical things that we believe have the net effect of minimizing the total time to that feedback loop. That is Lean Startup in a nutshell.
And you get asked a lot for larger companies, I think we try to maintain as much of a startup mindset as we can, and there's a lot that we're still doing in terms of proving the hypothesis of what a professional identity as a platform and professional network as a platform can do in the world. But we are larger in terms of sheer body count.
Yeah.
What are the things about to larger companies do you recommend about implementing the Lean Startup approach? What are like top 3 things we can do? Oh, and by the way, some of these questions came from, we had a LinkedIn group and a bunch of people asked questions, and so we
eat your own dog?
Yes,
yeah, good.
yes, and so we're summarizing these, and we're starting with the kind of the employee question.
Yeah.
But what are like the top 3 things we can do? What are classic mistakes that we can avoid?
So it's like if I have a friend who works at a big company and maybe it's not as entrepreneurial as he would like it to be.
Yes.
Yeah. No problem. So look, there's a lot of skepticism, and I think we should just be straight up about it. When you start to say, okay, people who work in big companies can be entrepreneurial, and it's like, oh boy, here comes another management fad. We're going to get some innovation expert to come in and tell everyone to do what's best for the company, like an Office Space. And I'm now considered an innovation expert, which, if that's not a contradiction in terms, I really don't know what is. So I get the call all the time now from big companies. A very strange thing. I published this book, and I was really focused on primarily, Silicon Valley startups. Like I worked in my career. And all I wanted to do was say, look, if we're going to put $40 million of VC into something, shouldn't we figure out if it's going to work like more, cheaper than $50 million in 5 years, like I kept doing in my career. So that was my original, impulse. And all of a sudden, people started coming up to me after talks and after they read the book and said, okay, I accept your challenge. And I was like, what challenge? What are you talking about? They're like, well, in the book you said the definition of a startup is a human institution designed to create something new under conditions of extreme uncertainty. I was like, uh-huh. Like, and you said in the book and in your talks, you always say that has nothing to do with the size of your company, what industry you're in, or even sector of the economy, right? And I'm like, yeah, I said that. Like, therefore, I'm in my big company. I think I apply. I'm an entrepreneur, and I want to use Lean Startup. And I would be like, well, good luck. I hope it works out. I mean, I wasn't planning to do that. I just thought this is a deductive consequence of the theory that says entrepreneurship really isn't about size. It has to do with uncertainty. And so, people started to say, well, would you come talk to my team? Would you come help? And I don't know about you, but when I started thinking about what would it be like to talk to some big company people about entrepreneurship, the image I had in my mind, it was not like this, okay? First of all, really big companies like I've had a chance to work with, the big industrial companies, I mean, it is, I was really picturing something very grim and very boring. Guys in suits and the usual thing. I was like, those are big company people who never, what would they know about innovation? They're not entrepreneurial. But the big surprise to me is that no matter where I go and no matter how big the company, I have met honest to God real entrepreneurs that just happen to go to work in a nice office and wear a suit. And they have health benefits. But that doesn't matter to being an entrepreneur. Whether you eat ramen noodles or not is irrelevant to being an entrepreneur. They're real. So I was like, all right, well, let's try and see what happens if we try to apply some of these ideas. And I've been really actually very surprised how relevant they are, even to internal entrepreneurs. Because fundamentally, the same problem that plagues intrapreneurs, if you will, plagues outside entrepreneurs, Silicon Valley guys. The fundamental question is, if I don't know what's supposed to happen, how do I know if I'm making progress? So, if we're building something that nobody wants, why would we be proud that we did it on time, on budget, with high quality, high scalability? That was my always it was really highly scalable, even though there were no customers. It's like, then why did we waste all that time working on, improving its performance? And we used to focus a lot on the 12th customer visit when we couldn't even get customers to download the software, and therefore they couldn't get them past the 0th customer visit. We were focused in the wrong area. So that issue I see all the time. And so in terms of what do you do to support internal entrepreneurs, the first thing is you have to recognize that management in an established company is a portfolio. It is some of the things you do are highly certain now. You now have a product that works extremely well. You know the seasonal effects. You know the patterns of variation. You know when to expect customers to show up and not. And you're trying to do the basic things that customers want from you, improving usability, improving performance, improving retention, just the basic win-wins of product development. And then there's parts of the portfolio that are highly uncertain, where you're trying to do something new. You're trying to bring the product to a new platform, new geography, new use case, new distribution channel, new business model. I don't know what you guys are working on, but I imagine a lot of it is new. If not, you got bigger problems than we can talk about today. So plus, you have competitors who are trying really hard to make your life as uncertain as possible. So I was with a company recently where I got a question from the audience. If we're in a highly stable business and we're killing it, and we're the market leader, do we really need to worry about all this stuff that you just talked about in your talk? And I was like, not really, as long as you're not subject to any kind of disruption. He's like, oh, good. He sat down, satisfied. And then he was like, wait, hold on, I have a follow-up. And everyone starts laughing, well, yeah, who's in a business that's not in the process of being disrupted now? If so, I'd like to meet them. I don't know what those businesses are. And certainly if there's some place that software is not eating your part of the world, just wait. Call me back in 2 years and let me know how it's going with your status. Doesn't matter to me. So anyway, given that there's all those sources of uncertainty, we want to manage the part of our portfolio that's in that high uncertainty using entrepreneurial techniques. And that's where we can actually consciously form startup teams. What's a startup team? A autonomous, cross-functional, dedicated team. I've seen established companies tend to really get stuck on those three elements because we wind up with a matrix organization and we want to be efficient to keep everybody busy, so we have everybody working on 92 different things. But multitasking and functional silos are really the enemy of innovation. We can, of course, talk about that more. I don't know how much that's relevant here. But then once we have that kind of team, then we can use a lot of the tools from the startup toolkit, just like you would, down the road in Silicon Valley.
So when you, one of the things that I think the team here wrestles with, one version of this, as you know, one of the things I've said frequently, if you're not embarrassed by your first product release you've released too late, it's partially to emphasize MVP, emphasize time, emphasize learning in terms of where you're going, as opposed to just saying, no, I pull back the thing. A variant that we run into is now that you have hundreds of millions of customers, you're live and you're visible. Embarrassment now comes at a much higher cost, so that gets an attention. There's a similar question when you think about the principles of kind of the lean startup, with also a consistent and delightful user experience. Any insights in terms of how to navigate that?
Well, first of all, I quote you all the time on if you haven't been, you're not embarrassed by the first version of your product, you waited too long. And I've developed what I consider to be the secret corollary, and I'm actually dying to know if you agree with.
Awesome.
Because I've been going around telling people that you probably would. I get to find out. Because
you're experimenting.
Yeah, exactly right. Exactly. I've been running this experiment. So here's my experience. The secret corollary is no matter how long you wait, you will be embarrassed by the first version of your product.
Yes.
Because the presupposition of people who say, why don't we slow down, and why don't we do the same thing slower, is if we slow down, get less feedback, and take longer to do it, then that will produce a better outcome for customers. They'll be more delighted. And my question is, where is the evidence for this thesis? That going slower and getting less feedback leads to more delightful, I know we all think that, well, not, obviously not for everybody else, the companies that you work with, whose products you use, wouldn't you wish they would have gotten a little more feedback before they foisted that new version on you and forced you to use it? I won't name any specific names, but you can imagine who I'm talking about. You're gee, just test that with one person, please. But then when it's our thing, we're well, I'm going to go in the cave and just figure it all out at the whiteboard, for as long as it takes and come out when it's done. And how often does that actually produce a delightful experience, as a matter of fact? Yet it's deeply intuitive that what we call larger batch sizes as we move from kind of stage to stage of work. So how much work goes from design to implementation to verification to deployment. We have an intuition that the longer those cycles, the better, because we can really be efficient and kind of work out all the details and make quality right. And the problem is quality is really in the eye of the beholder, which means if for a for-profit company, quality is defined by the customer and what they want. So if we are misaligned with the customer about what quality means, then all the extra time we take to polish all the edges and get everything really right is wasted time, because we wind up pushing the product away from what the customer actually wants. And I'll give you an example from InView. This drives me crazy as an engineer. So some people have played 3D video games like The Sims, World of Warcraft, pick your favorite video game. There's a lot of technology that goes into suspending disbelief so that when your character moves around a scene in a 3D video game, it feels real. And Don, to get into it, those who are interested, there's something called inverse kinematics, which is so that when the avatar's feet walk on the floor, the foot actually goes onto the floor and it matches the surface, even though the surface is uneven. Because if the foot goes through the floor, you're all ugh, that's like a ghost. That's not an avatar. And a lot of physics to make sure that when I'm sitting at a table with Reid and I go to pick up my coffee, my sleeve doesn't accidentally go through the table. Right? Some of you are familiar with this? So when we first built InView, which is a 3D social network, we didn't have the time and budget really to invest in all that technology. So we came up with a hack, which was when you would be sitting at a scene like this with Reid in our social situation, we would just anchor your avatar to the chair and not let you move around. So no moving around means no inverse kinematics, no physics, no nothing. You're anchored in place. And you'd be shocked to hear that customers would use that product and they would complain that it made them feel claustrophobic, that they're we succeeded in the suspension of disbelief, but you're stuck in the chair. You can't move. So the feedback was always customers wanted to move, wanted to move, wanted to move. And we were oh God, this is going to mean millions of dollars of research to get all this physics and everything right and whatever. We didn't have that kind of budget. So we one night, as a lame hack, it was late in the morning, I was feeling a little delirious. I was what if we just made it so that when you click to a different place in the scene, we just erased your avatar from the old place and moved you directly to the new place? Okay, so I mean a jump cut, but the worst possible kind. You're in the middle of moving the cup of coffee, and then all of a sudden you're standing across the room. The suspension of disbelief is ruined. It's actually the camera that has to zoom, and the camera's surprised, so it's fly over there, but what's going on? The camera could fly through a wall while doing it. It's we're and so our first impulse was no way, is it going to ruin our brand? The customers are going to hate it, whatever. But we were running out of time, basically. So we're like, well, let's just try it as an experiment and see what happens. And we were so embarrassed by the experiment, we weren't even willing to ask customers what they thought about it, because that would call attention to it. So we just didn't say anything, and just were like, we'll see if anybody noticed. And almost the next day, immediately, we started getting this feedback from customers that we couldn't understand. We all of a sudden were rated, our product was more advanced than The Sims. People were using the word advanced to describe our product. And we're like, why? We literally had to bring people into an office and be like, so talk to us about this versus The Sims. They're like, oh, it's so great. In The Sims, when you want to walk around the scene, you have to wait while your avatar gets up out of the chair and walks. In InView, you teleport. Who wouldn't rather teleport to wherever you want to go? And we were like, oh, God, customers are so stupid. How could they think that? And then we're like, wait, we're done. So I tell the story. And the problem with telling stories about mistakes you made, you know this. People are like, what a bunch of idiots. But once you know the answer, everything is obvious. So I'm sure we sound like complete morons. Sorry. We were. It's like, well, why didn't you just do it right in the first place? If we'd known what was right in the first place, yeah, of course we would have done that. The question I have, especially for the engineers in the room, is which version of the product is higher quality? The one with the teleportation or the one with the inverse kinematics? We know which one is more expensive. We know which one has more lines of code. We know which ones we would prefer to work on because it's a more interesting problem. But from the customer's point of view, what's higher quality? I claim the dumb hack is actually higher quality than the super high-tech, beautiful outcome. Now, that's really distressing to those of us who've built our professional identity on quality work because we want to be the arbiters of quality. And so the kind of lesson of lean startup is not quality doesn't matter, not you should just do things cheap, quick, dumb, crappy. Rather, quality is in the eye of the beholder. So in order to get the only truly accurate path to get to a high quality outcome is simply to test your assumptions along the way and give yourself time to have customers react to what you do so that you can fix the quality problems you didn't even know to be thinking about in the first place.
So I'm certain you've gotten this question before, but actually I've never heard the answer, so I'm going to ask it anyway. The obvious, completely eccentric, possible counterpoint is Apple and Jobs. Yeah. So what's your point of view?
I'm fascinated by Apple because people ask me about it all the time, and nobody knows anything. I mean, this is the problem: is reliable information about what really goes on behind the curtain at Apple is extremely hard to come by. And so when people come in and say Apple's the counter argument to your point of view, I'm like, well, why don't you tell me the Apple way? And then we'll compare it to my way. And I've now done that experiment with hundreds of people, and they tell me completely different stories every time. Like for everything to do at Apple just came out of Steve Jobs' head fully formed, and he just told them what to do, and then he wrote down a little sketch, and then like some monkeys made something happen, and then they launched it on stage. And then other people have read, like if you read a book like Inside Apple, there's a new book coming out. I don't know if people saw that excerpt about the launch of the original iPhone and how it came to be. Like, it's a highly complicated and iterative and confusing story that makes basically no sense with like the public narrative of Apple. So the first issue is, it's like, I don't really know what we're talking about when we talk about the Apple way. Is it something that is replicable? I always assume that Steve Jobs was perfectly happy for everyone to believe that the way things worked is he just thought up ideas and then nothing else had to be done, because that was like a major competitive advantage if any of his competitors were dumb enough to believe that. But so first issue, we don't really know. But like, so take the original iPhone, because some details have just started to be reported on, how that came to pass. I was totally stunned to learn that everyone remembers when Steve was standing up on stage holding up the iPhone and showing its amazing features in that original big like nationwide press conference, basically. Everyone remembers that. Okay. How many iPhones had ever been manufactured at that time through Apple's mass production process? Anyone know the answer? 0. They had no production process, no supply chain, nothing figured out at that time. They had less than 100 demo units that they had made by hand up to that point. And the specific sequences of actions that he took on stage that day were what they called internally the golden path of specific taps that you could do that would just barely work and not crash. He made it seem like I'm just doing whatever I feel like. Oh, I'll call so-and-so. And if he had done anything at all different, phone would instantly crash. And there were 5 other prototype phones under the table right there, so that if it crashed, he could put it down and pick up the next one in case he screwed up. the thing was hard-coded to show 5 bars because the wireless thing was restarting constantly. I mean, like, everything about this is completely wrong. It's like horrible, buggy thing. And yet people stood in line to buy that thing because of what? Because they saw a video of Steve Jobs talking about it, making it look real. If that doesn't sound like a Kickstarter campaign to you, like, it's just, you know, a really expensive big one where the stakes were extremely high. So I think you'll see, like, MVP is about constraining the problem you have to solve to get that first customer feedback. I'm very confident that if the thing had been a flop, they wouldn't have had to set up a production process and supply chain. Like, they're not, you know, they're stubborn, but they're not that stubborn. So, you know, I think there are elements of it that you can see there. What's most interesting to me, though, is this issue around secrecy. In that new excerpt, you can see all the people that work for, a lot of people that work for Steve quit because he just, you know, we would drive him too hard, and he was obsessed with secrecy. And he, like, for him, it was like they describe it like it was some kind of like spy game. He got a real charge out of like making it a thing where like certain employees were allowed to know what was going on and others weren't. And so the other one, I mean, it caused like massive, huge problems. And so you ask yourself, was that a necessary part of the Apple innovation strategy, or was that Steve's just one of his many quirks that, you know, maybe you don't want to copy? How would you even answer a question like that? Like, I don't know who do you even ask to find out whether that was really effective or not? Like, I don't really know. So what I do know is that most of the people who want to be Steve Jobs do not get Steve Jobs-like results. Or I should rephrase, they get early Steve Jobs-like results, like they get fired. They don't get late Steve Jobs results like they're standing on stage and the president calls. Like, that's not what happens. So just as a matter of practice, is it because they're not as good as Steve Jobs? Or is it because his method is not replicable? Or is it because we don't really... Like, practically speaking, does it matter which of those things it is? The practical answer to me is just verbatim copying what he did doesn't seem to produce very good results for anybody, you know, except for a very rare talent.
Very cool. So how do you build a culture that supports risk-taking? Because, you know, obviously some experiments don't work out. You know, culture needs to be durable across experiments. In larger companies, you frequently have a number of what you were referring to as certain processes, but winning processes.
Yeah.
What are some of the techniques or thoughts that you share there?
I have a diagram in the book I call the Startup Way, based on a book that some of you will know called the Toyota Way. And it's just a simple diagram that says the way you do this is accountability, process, culture, people, in that order. It's a pyramid, you know, a classic consultant's pyramid diagram with accountability at the bottom. When people want to do this in their company, their intuition is almost exactly backwards. It's like, if I want to be entrepreneurial and innovative in my company, I got to go get some fancy entrepreneurs. My regular, boring employees will never get it done. So let me go get some fancy people. I'll go buy some company or get somebody who wears jeans and rides around on a scooter or whatever. And then if I'm really advanced, I'll put up some posters. Everybody be more innovative. You know, be creative. You know, there's a trend now, you guys have noticed, to copy Facebook's spray-painted slogans. They have all these really cool slogans on the walls, like move fast and break things. And there's like a trend in corporate America that you copy those spray-painted slogans and put them on your walls, you'll get the same results. And it's just like, oh my God. The slogans are just to remind people of something they already know. If you go into a research lab, there aren't posters up that say, everybody use science. And if you look at the employee handbook, it doesn't say use science. So use science is considered obvious. Well, how else would you go about doing research? Well, we just know. Well, how did you know? Did anybody tell you? No, something you just know. Well, that's culture. Where did the culture of just using science come from? At some time in the past, sometimes in the distant past, it was a process. We had to there was a time we had to remind people in research. Industrial research labs are a relatively novel phenomenon in the last 100 years. They were incredibly difficult to set up, and one of the hard things to do was to get people to use the same scientific procedure for every kind of research that they did. So the culture you have today is an artifact of the process decisions you made in the past. And people make process decisions totally directly related to how they're held accountable. So I actually spend a lot of my time talking about accounting, which is incredibly boring and nobody wants to talk about, so I'm sorry. But suffice to say, if you're willing to hold people accountable for what they learned, rather than for what we call vanity metrics or gross results in the high uncertainty part of the portfolio, then you can do this change. And it's tricky because you're explicitly saying these managers over here, you know, who are supposed to drive like our seasonal campaigns around, I don't know what the seasonal important holidays are for LinkedIn. My background's consumer internet. It's probably exactly opposite for you guys. But like,
Christmas.
What's that?
Christmas.
You got it big in Christmas?
No.
Yeah, exactly right. Yeah.
Christmas is the dip and New Year's is
yeah. So InView is exactly opposite. Yeah. When the kids are at home, usage is way up when people have to go to school or be at work. Usage go down. So we have the opposite account. We could do some kind of cool hedge there probably. Anyway,
it's
so
an AWS hedge.
Yeah, exactly right. Except the costs are constantly falling, so you make less money every time. It's not a good deal. Don't do that hedge. Is my advice to you. So those managers, like, they have to deliver. Okay, they say we're going to have 10% better whatever retention, performance, revenue this quarter overlap. Like, they have to deliver. Okay, they have to hit those numbers or they're bad managers. But in the innovation part of the portfolio, predictions are impossible. So what happens is, first problem we make is we tend to stack rank projects by ROI. So it's like, look, we obviously want to invest our dollars in the highest ROI projects. So let's have everybody make a plan for what's going to happen in the future. We'll evaluate the benefit we got, divided by how much we think it's going to cost, and then we'll stack rank. Well, in an innovation situation, high uncertainty situation, the R and the I are both unknown. So we have an undefined value that we're stack ranking against highly defined values. That doesn't fare very well. So to solve that problem, our innovators are like, oh, okay, what I have to do to get funded, this will sound familiar in the VC world too, is produce a ludicrous plan, like what we call a fantasy plan, that has within it what we call the plausible promise. Like, how ludicrous of a result can I promise that's not so ludicrous that I seem crazy? Right, so it's like in a suitably distant time from now, we will make a suitably large amount of money. Like 5 years from now, we'll make $100 million if I'm pitching Reid at the Greylock, I'm guessing.
It's not a good pitch, but yes.
Yeah. It's like, you're like, write about this. You're calibrating. What can I get away with? So you make this plan that has super high ROI, and that's how you got the thing funded. And then as entrepreneurs, we tend to complain when the people we gave that plan to turn it around and say, thank you for this extremely detailed accountability framework. You said month by month exactly what's going to happen in the future, so I'm just, like I do with our regular managers, going to sit here, watch my watch, and say, hey, did you deliver the revenue right on time? And of course, now you're comparing a fantasy plan to real life. So it's like, you could actually have a team that's like on its way to the playoffs, but you're like, well, but my fantasy team did better. So you're fired. Manager's fired because it didn't do as well as my fantasy baseball team. It's like, that isn't actually, that's totally insane. But in a corporate context, we often trick ourselves into doing that. So we have to be willing to partition off the high uncertainty part of our portfolio, which means admitting that there are some things that we don't know, which is very difficult in most corporate settings because management 101 is to project confidence and to get high morale through perceived certainty. Make the problems, kind of sweep them under the rug, not make them be known. So this is about saying, no, we're going to put our problems front and center because our failures are where our learnings come from. We're going to hold accountable not to ROI, but to leading indicators that indicate that we're making progress towards learning something of value. And we're going to therefore be patient with the fact that most of our innovation teams are going to fail more often than they succeed, and that can't be a black mark on their permanent record. We have to have personnel files. It can't just be like, oh, failure, 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 this person's not a good person. We've got to say, look, an entrepreneurial type manager needs a different performance evaluation. So it's quite difficult because then you say, well, who gets the special treatment of the entrepreneurial evaluation and who doesn't? That's an executive decision that has to be made at the highest levels of the company for them to really say, we have made a decision about which elements of our strategy we consider certain and not. And now you're talking about, especially in the context of a public company, are you really prepared to formally admit, as in writing, that there are things that you consider to be uncertain about your strategy? So there's a reason why this is hard to do. It really strikes right to the heart, the foundations of the kind of comfort zone of modern management.
Any good suggestions on how the accountability to learning is best measured in that?
Sure, for your friend's company?
Yes, my friend's company.
Yeah, totally. No, look, I think this is a fascinating topic, and not everybody does. So I'll try to answer briefly, and we can talk more about it.
Innovation accounting is my next question.
So yeah. Okay. Well, so we'll keep going. Listen, I think this is really interesting. So, all right, let's say I claim that I learned something, and you're skeptical. How can I prove it to you? Like, I can tell you a great story. Like, oh, I talked to a bunch of customers, and they said, you will not believe this. When I talk to customers, they said the thing I always am talking about we got to do, customers agree with me. You believe it? Well, I learned a tremendous amount. You ever fallen victim to that? It's like, oh yeah, Well, guess what? I talked to customers and they said the opposite. So screw you. It's like, oh shoot, now what are we gonna do? Right? So who really learned something? Like if you come back and you're like, oh listen, I promised you millions of dollars in revenue. I missed my accountability target by 3 orders of magnitude, right? So I have not millions of dollars in revenue, but thousands, and not billions of customers, but hundreds of customers. But I've learned so much. you should totally give me more money and more time and let me keep going with this project. It's like, well, literally, you would have the exact same story if you were in fact on the brink of success as if you were like Bozo the Clown and you set the money on fire and did nothing. If you just like goofed off and like did absolutely no work, in both cases you would have almost no revenue, no nothing. So how do you prove that you learned something? Well, science has an answer to this. You prove that you learned something by making hypotheses and testing them, and then getting better at making better hypotheses over time. So this is the problem with the way science is taught in like, grade school and high schools these days, where I don't know how many of you had to learn science this way, but it's like problem statement, hypothesis, data, experiment, conclusion, whatever. And you're told in advance what the conclusion you're supposed to get is, because like you're testing something that's well known. And so like if you didn't get the right conclusion, you made an error in your experiment, you just go do it over again. But it's like a one-time thing. Real actual science proceeds iteratively. You start with hypothesis, say, okay, I think customers are going to want such and such thing. And then you run the experiment, and they don't want it. You're not done. You actually haven't learned anything yet. Because when you do an MVP, like classic MVP is something like you put up a landing page. You say, I'm going to offer you this cool thing, sign up here. And then on the second page, you might say, I'm sorry, it's not available yet, but we'll contact you as soon as it's available. So it's an experiment to see, are people even interested in finding out? People spend a lot of time designing the apology page, which is always wrong, because if nobody signs up, you just leave that as a 404. It doesn't matter. So the classic thing is you run that experiment, and you get a 0% sign up. Now, sometimes that's because your value proposition, this is usually the case for me, so bad no customer on earth would ever want it at all. Right? So that you really whiffed. It's like a total invalidation of your hypothesis. And sometimes you made a JavaScript error, and if people click the button, it doesn't actually work. So you got 0% sign up because there's a JavaScript error and the button's not wired up properly. And so you can hit, customers might be dying to get your thing, but the metrics will still be 0%. Now, how do you know which is which? You can't know in advance. You look at metrics, say we didn't hit the hypothesis, now how do we know? Well, hopefully what happens is you immediately, as soon as possible, do your next experiment. You say, well, what do we think happened? We think, the classic thing, almost every entrepreneur, designer, engineer will always say, well, if we just didn't explain it well enough. The design wasn't good enough. It wasn't usable enough. Let's improve the usability. Rather than admit that our thing is wrong, let's improve the usability. And I always say, great, let's do it. Like, let's take 2, 3, 4 shots at improving the usability. If you're building a product that nobody wants, as I have many times in my career, improving the usability, making it easier to use, makes it easier for customers to realize that they don't want to use it. And actually, it's worse than it was before. So I'm like, great, let's make some usability improvements. So I'll give you an example. I was working on a product where for 6 straight months, practically, we improved the quality of the product every day, fixing bugs, fixing bugs, fixing bugs. And on a cohort-by-cohort basis, the metrics were completely the same, like to the point that I was becoming paranoid. Because like 100 customers would come to our website today, and one of them would buy, which is exactly what happened yesterday. And I'm like, did the people today have a conference call with the people from yesterday to be like, hey, everybody, how many of you bought? OK, because it was incredibly stable, but the product's getting so much better every day. Or is it? Right? I am fixing bugs. I am improving performance. I am improving usability. But am I actually making the product better in the eyes of the customer? I think the evidence is very clear. No. So even though I had great stories about how we had learned that quality is so important, I had no evidence to support my contention. Whereas I've been in situations where on a cohort-by-cohort basis, you can show those leading indicators starting to go up. You can say, look, we haven't yet made more money, but 6 months ago, 3% of people were converting to pay, and then it was 5%, and then 7%, and then 10%. Well, the business plan says that it still has to be 25%. So we're not there, but we're starting to move in the right direction by kind of the right order of magnitude. And so you can infer from that that we must be learning something, because our actions are causing a change in customer behavior. And that's, again, going back to Science 101, you show that our hypotheses are getting better about what actually works.
So I'm going to ask one more question. People can start lining up for questions, because after this we open the floor. If no one stands up, I have another 20. But
great.
I don't think we have enough time for them. How do you avoid in the innovation accounting, what techniques do you use to avoid local maxima?
Yeah.
Right? Because, for example, one of the things I would actually push back on the 404 page is actually the reason why you don't do a 404 page is because in the case it's a positive result, you don't want to piss people off.
Absolutely right.
So there's a time sequence to it. So what are the techniques that you found most helpful in avoiding local maxima?
Yeah, so when I first learned about split testing and A/B testing and kind of statistical inference and big data, it wasn't called that back then, I was just like, this is awesome. Like, this is going to take all the messy human parts out of product development, and it's going to turn product development into like a crank that I can just turn as an engineer, and I'll just like split test my way, and anything that improves click-through rates like is good, and therefore, and like if you do that, I swear to God, you will be selling porn in no time. Because just like whatever it takes to improve click-through rates, it's like you do not want to go there. Okay, you will have a psychic hotline and like nasty stuff.
You just generated
overnight.
some questions.
Yeah, yeah. Okay, good. So now we got something to talk about. Listen, it's a horrifying experience when you kind of realize you've really gone head down and you've actually deviated from your overall vision. And that's, for engineers, that's the local maxima problem, which is like you get to some place where there is no minor change you can make that improves, but if you were willing to make a major change, you could improve to a new slope. And the first thing is actually goes all the way back to the concept of the pivot. The reason we talk about pivoting separate from optimization is the pivot is the jump out of the local maximum. The number one indicator that it's time to pivot is that your experiments reach a point of diminishing returns. Like where usability improvements aren't getting it done, and you've got to make a change to the underlying strategy involving whatever the company is. And because that's so hard to do, we much prefer to just do optimization. Now, the reason people find this concept confusing is most of the tactical techniques of optimization, split testing, smoke testing, landing page, all this stuff, they come out of direct marketing and like huge website optimization techniques, right? I mean, you guys are, I'm sure, very familiar. There must be some part of the LinkedIn site where it's just like every 1/10 of a point of click-through rate here is worth $1 billion, in the next 10 years. So we're going to work really hard. Like think about Amazon's checkout button. It's like, if you can change the shade of color on that button and increase click-through rates by 1/100%, you just made, astronomical amounts of money. So you focus on that little stuff. But just because we're using those techniques doesn't mean we should test little things. In fact, the issue in a startup is if you're testing the little stuff, you're thinking too small, because we're looking for things with extremely high signal-to-noise ratio. Like, is our basic strategy working at all? So if you need large sample sizes, and if you're worried about the 1/10% here and there, you've kind of missed the point. So it's tricky. We're going to take those same techniques but apply them to big changes. Now here's the curse of product development. What's a big change? Who defines what's big? Is it defined by what's hard to do by engineers? Oh no, big is defined in the eyes of the customer. Well, now we have a problem. Sometimes what we consider to be tiny little changes are massive to the customer. And sometimes what we consider to be huge, really exciting changes mean nothing to the customer. So when I say only test big things, you're like, well, only test things that the customer perceives big, but how do you know what the customer perceives big? Oh, you don't. So now you have to test to find out. So it's actually, that part is really frustrating. But you have to just take whatever you honestly believe will make a big difference. Like, I love working with entrepreneurs who think they're working on teleportation, like actual teleport. Like, a lot of entrepreneurs are just like, my thing is so great, everybody in the world is going to want it. I call it teleportation because who wouldn't want teleportation, right? It's like, it's a great product. Anyone's working on that, like...
Depends on how you describe it. If you decided I'm going to disintegrate you and create a clone, I'm not sure you get as universal.
That's why I love this example, because actually trying to sell teleportation would be incredibly difficult. Yes. You're like, you're going to do what to my body? Yes. And how many other people have tried it successfully first? You're like, well, wouldn't you like to be the first person? But entrepreneurs don't think about that. They're just like, this thing is so great, everyone's going to want it. And everyone's going to want it is the ultimate testable hypothesis. If everyone's going to want it, that also means 10 people are going to want it. Correct? I mean, you're saying 100% conversion rate. So I just take 10 people and see, hey, and I'm sure you're right, but why don't we double check? Let's just double check. Just what could it hurt? It's so cheap and easy to run this experiment. Let's just double check. And what happens is the first time you do that and 0 of 10 say they would want to be teleported, if you'd be the first person to be teleported, the entrepreneur will be like, you found the wrong 10 person. I say this all the time. How could you have found this customer? We once had a customer come in for a usability test, and we're like, hey, we want you to use this product. And they were like, no thanks. And we're like, I don't think you understand how a usability test works. We're paying you to be here, so take this out. And they were like, you can keep your money. We're like, okay, fire that customer. Where did you, and I was looking at my co-founder like, where did you find this moron? Next, I swear to God, it happened 3 times in a row. You know exactly what I said, too. Well, hold on, is that a statistically significant sample? Yeah, it's a significant, it's such a big signal-to-noise ratio. So like that, those are the indicators to say, okay, we got to take a step back, and the things that we think are big and matter to customers don't. We got to take a bigger swing, try something different. And that's, that really is why pivoting is such a critical part of the methodology, and why if you adopt the techniques of lean startup like split testing without the pivot and the other theory, you will not get a good result.
Cool.
So my question was around, like, once you see that the MVP is successful, you can actually go two different ways. You can start adding the features that you didn't get around to, or you could be like, actually, we want to scale this, build a way to scale it, support it, maybe a sales team. How do you think about that trade-off once you get the MVP out there, of like when you need to move on to those other features, or when the MVP maybe is just good enough?
Yeah, so there's two schools of thought in this, and way I describe them, you'll know, of course, where I come down. One school of thought is you use MVPs in Lean Startup to do your early testing, to discover what the right product is, and then you go into scaling the right product. So there's like learning phase and execution phase. And of course, my preferred way of thinking about it is that there's no such thing as execution phase. You're learning all the way till you're the market leader and you dominate and you win. Then you can think about whether you want to just do some execution. But of
By
course,
the way, what do you think of the phrase permanent beta? I never
What's
asked
that?
you that. The permanent beta phrase that we use.
like, I don't like it as a customer-facing concept because customers treat beta as different than actual products, and they think, wait, hold on, what is beta? Like, but in terms of understanding that our goal is continuous improvement, it's funny, like you look at how Toyota makes cars, they're talking about continuous improvement in the manufacturing of it. So like if they don't think they're ever done, and they've been at this for a long time, and they're the market leader by a lot, and they've been crushing their competitors for a long time, and they're like, we're never done. Like, we really think our thing is harder than cars to make. Have you ever understand how complicated it is to manufacture a car at scale? Like, whatever. So I really think our goal should be continuous improvement. And what that means is there's no such thing as the MVP is done. Every MVP is immediately launched into the next MVP. So I really believe that the way to work is on some kind of cadence of regular releases. And, I work with industrial companies where a fast cadence might be a quarterly or an annual release. But in software, there's no excuse for, basically there's no excuse anymore not to practice continuous deployment. And therefore, your release cadence is immediate, and your kind of evaluation cadence, like is this working, can be monthly or every 6 weeks, something like that. But anyway, whatever that cadence is, you're always going into the next MVP, and the next MVP is a little bit more sophisticated, a little bit better than the previous one. Now, in what ways can it be better? You name the two. We can improve the scope of the MVP by adding features. We can improve its performance or usability, or we can increase the scope in terms of the number of customers who are seeing it. And actually, that goes all the way back to the embarrassment thing we were talking about. The key thing to an MVP is to let the scope in all three of those dimensions match the uncertainty. It's not embarrassing if 100 customers try something and don't like it, because you can apologize to those 100 customers. Like, there's so few that you can send them a hand-engraved, letter-pressed apology note. I mean, I've done that. Like, I've personally had to email people and say, hi, really sorry that product sucked and you didn't like it, And they were like so excited, like, wow, the CTO of the company personally sent me an apology? Well, I must be an important person. And so it actually proves a perfectly nice outcome. So we do these things in a small, contained way. It really reduces the risk, that someone's going to find out about it that's going to blow up in our face. Or like, even God forbid, some journalist happens to be in the first group of 100 and they write about it. You can be like, sorry, we screwed up. We apologize. We took it. We fixed the problem. Immediately. So it's no big deal. As you get better at it, then you can kind of increase that sandbox to be bigger and bigger and bigger until it's big enough that you want to reincorporate it into your normal business operations and make it part of your core product. But I think there's no like one right answer. Sometimes you want to increase scope by adding features, sometimes by improving performance, sometimes by adding more customers. Does that make sense?
So my question's about really sort of managing and quantifying uncertainty. So you give the example of a manager stack ranking projects, and that you have to siphon out the ones where essentially the variance is treated as 0 versus ones where the variance is really high. Or the example of the pitch to Reid saying, oh, you will make $100 million in 5 years, which apparently didn't work out. But at some level, if you say, look, I think we're going to make this with some probability, and at this point, we'll have reduced the risk. And this is what software developers are told they should do for estimation. Is there a fair enough, but is there a similar methodology either that works or that you recommend for at least having an initial stab at both the expected value and the variance and the schedule in which that reduces? Yeah,
I may be the last person in startup land who's pro-business plan, which I find kind of strange. Like it's like a theme now, like business plans are bad. And it's true that the prose part of business plans, I think, is more or less a waste of time. That's just fiction writing. And you have to do a certain amount of it but nobody reads those plans like, oh, good, now I know what to do every day because it says so in the LinkedIn business plan somewhere.
There wasn't one.
Yeah, obviously not. Because how could you possibly have foreseen? I mean,
Yes.
you know.
Fiction, exactly.
Yes, good fiction writing. But the quantitative part, the spreadsheet, that usually is an Appendix B in the back of the business plan, I think is one of the most valuable documents you can produce when creating something new. The issue is that we use that tool in absolutely the wrong way. We tend to focus on the outputs of the spreadsheet. So the spreadsheet says how much revenue we're going to have by year in the future. And you make those projections because somebody said make me some projections. But no, we all understand that they're not right. So like I was working with an industrial company, and we were doing a workshop, and I had a bunch of very important people in the room, and we were looking at a project plan of one of these graphs, and it had this amazing graph of future projected revenue for this product for the next 25 years. And I'm like, okay, who in this room believes in this forecast? And every person in the room raised their hand. Like, this is the official approved forecast by the company. We've invested a lot of money in this program on the basis of this forecast. I was like, but seriously, who really believes that in the year 2025, and everyone's hand got down. They're like, well, of course, we don't know. So the outputs of the spreadsheet we know are bogus. But the inputs are extremely valuable. The bottoms-up spreadsheet is a tool for translating individual customer behaviors in a microeconomic sense into a macroeconomic outcome that people care about. So first of all, a lot of business plans can immediately disprove that there's any business to be had here, because there simply is no reasonable mathematical equation that can turn this proposed behavior into, it's like our thing. It's like the old joke about we're going to lose money on every item, but we're going to make it up in volume, right? Occasionally, you see those business plans, and you say, well, let me show you a spreadsheet that shows how that can never work, deductively. But most of the time, the spreadsheet is perfectly reasonable. And so you can use that for market sizing analysis. You say, look, well, is there at least a chance that this thing could be monster? Yes, it could. OK, good. Now let's take all of the inputs, every single one of the inputs to that spreadsheet, and let's use those as our innovation accounting dashboard, so that we can translate. And I talked about making learning objective. Here we can turn learning not just objective and something that we've proven. We can translate the language of learning into something that finance actually cares about. You ever notice how finance doesn't give a crap about learning? Because you can't put learning in the annual report. You can't disperse learning to your limited partners. Like, nobody really cares about learning. They care about money. So how do I show that the things I've learned are going to translate on a net present value basis into money that somebody cares about? Well, the business plan is a document that does that. You can show, as I improve those baseline numbers, I can rerun the model and show you what the net present value expected revenue for the business is. And so you can use that for rankings and for investment decisions, because now you have something that's denominated in net present value, which is fundamentally what we need for financial estimation and projection.
Thanks.
Sure.
I was wondering where competition fits in this idea of continuous innovation, because a lot of times when we're innovating, we benchmark ourselves against competition.
Yeah, that's fine as long as you're not the market leader. Oops. Like, what are you guys going to do? Who are you going to benchmark yourself against? Like, I think that's totally messed up. So I basically think that the modern rule of competition is whoever learns fastest wins. So if you have a faster, and if people who know maneuver warfare and OODA loops, and any military vets we have in the room will understand, there's a really strong theory that says if you can figure out what's going on, make decisions, and act on those decisions faster than the person you're competing with, fundamentally, you're a blur to them, and they can't do a thing about it. So to me, that's the competitive asset that I prize above all, is the ability to get through that build, measure, learn feedback loop faster than my competitors. If I'm on the winning side of that equation, then every time they come out with something good, I can steal it faster than they can do anything about it. Because I'm just like, oh, that's a great idea. Thanks for that good idea. And I'll just, don't mind if I do. Or I'll just wait and see. Right? Imagine you're on a monthly release cycle and your competitor's on a yearly release cycle. So like, they release something, and you're like, well, I'm not sure if it's a good idea. Oh, that's no big deal. I'll wait 3 months, see if it's a good idea, and then the 4th month I'll come out with it myself. And meanwhile, they're like plotting, we got them now. And it's just like, but they can't do anything about it. You've copied them and come out with 10 more things by the time they can even respond to you. If you're on the losing side of that equation, life sucks. Because for the exact reason, you can't come out with anything good without it being immediately copied. And if you want to watch this in action, just watch the Asian consumer electronics guys go into businesses that used to have long cycle times, like appliances, TVs, refrigerators, phones. Like, those guys do not mess around, because consumer electronics is one of the worst businesses in the world. It's low margin, extremely difficult, fast cycle time, fad oriented, and if you miss one technological thing, you're out. So those guys are like, look at appliances is easy. let's go do that. Like and and it's disruptive innovation. They start with the low end, crappy like dorm refrigerators, and don't pay attention. They're like, yes, don't pay attention, exactly. And like every quarter they come out with a new one. Next thing you know, they're making high-end stuff, and your whole business collapses. So to me, that's the issue with competition. So I don't think, like, what are you going to benchmark against in that situation? So like think about, Nokia, or I don't know, pick your favorite company that just got destroyed by consumer electronics. Who are they going to benchmark against? Like when Samsung comes for you, you didn't even know they were in your business, and next thing you know, like, I mean, those guys play nasty. They got $1 billion judgment against them, and they're like, well, whatever. Like, we don't care because we just made $10 billion entering and destroying your market. So bring it on. Like, they play rough. So those are the competitors that I fear, and you can't benchmark against them because how are you going to know? They come at you when you don't expect it, which means, right? So to me, the benchmark is, are we doing better? Like, we have to be our own benchmark. If we're the market leader, we have to say, are we constantly improving our cycle time? Are we constantly improving our performance with regard to learning new things about customers? And are we guaranteed that we're the fastest learning cycle time business on the planet? And if the answer to those things are yes, you look at a company like Toyota, the answer is yes, no one's going to want to mess with you.
So Reid's book dealt with taking the startup principles and applying to the individual development. What are your thoughts on applying lean startup principles to the individual?
I think it's a great idea. I mean, people often ask me, obviously we're not going to get this question here because LinkedIn is such a great company, but in other companies I get the question, my boss doesn't get it, or my management team is their head in the sand.
It's usually Reid doesn't get it, but yeah.
Yeah, I'm just trying to be polite.
Yeah.
Is there anything I can do? And I really believe that every person has the ability, if they want, to apply these principles to the work that they do every day. Because the truth is, life is short, and your personal time and energy is a very scarce resource. And we're like gamblers with it. It's like, this isn't like a statistical survey where you come up with the right answer. This is much more like gambling, like playing poker or something, where every day you pay an ante, which is a day of your life. And the question is, what did you get for that? And so I meet people all the time who are doing work that in their hearts they know doesn't matter to anybody. Nobody cares. And I think to tolerate that is almost a criminally negligent waste of human potential. So what I recommend to people is just, if you're interested, if you want to practice lean startup before you have a big team that works for you and you can kind of dictate terms, it's just to say, look, you think the work you do matters. Prove it. Right? I'm sure you're right, but let's double check. What's the evidence that the work you did today actually accomplished anything? I mean, sure you were busy, sure you spent money, sure you're a day older, but how do we know that you actually had any kind of impact? And when it's like, well, I added a feature to our waterfall development process specification document for a product that will come out in 3 years. It's like, well, how do I know that that was even the right product, or that it's going to be, like, think about all the questions that you're like, uh-oh, that doesn't sound too good. Or it's like, oh yeah, let's laugh at the waterfall development guys, but hold on. I pulled a story off a storyboard that was in prioritized order, and I built it according to the specifications of the product owner. How do I know the product owner knows what the customer wants? I don't know. He seems like he does. Seems like a smart guy. Was he right the last time? I don't know. Did we measure even what happened the last time? Uh-oh. How many months of my life have I been pulling stories off a queue prioritized by a guy who doesn't know what the customer wants? That doesn't sound very good. And then how do you think the guy prioritizing feels? He doesn't know what's going on. Like, he doesn't know fundamentally if his prioritization decisions are actually right or not. But he can't admit that because you would eat him alive. He's supposed to project confidence, right? So, like, think about all the people who are, like, wasting their lives doing this kabuki dance to pretend like we know what's going on when it's not. Like, how much, not at LinkedIn, of course, but at other companies, how much more satisfying would it be if every time we took an action, we knew for sure that it either worked or it didn't work. And if it didn't work, we had the opportunity to learn and immediately influence the next action. To me, that's what it, that's what I take the startup of you to mean, which is there's no such thing as a safe job, a safe career, nothing's safe, because your life is precious and you owe it to yourself to have an impact. And you can't rely on somebody else to tell you what's going to have an impact or not, because nobody really knows. So given that nobody knows, like, why not experiment? Why not double check?
Someone may take exception to the kabuki theater metaphor, given other things, but not for LinkedIn, but just as a general, given lean methodologies and all the rest.
Yeah, I got to be careful what I say.
But with that, we are over time. Eric is running a conference in December which he goes into much more depth in these things. And as you can tell, will be stunning and amazing, because you may be the easiest person I've ever interviewed in terms of ask question, ooh, great output. Ask question, great output.
Well, thank you. The tables will be turned in December because Reid will be one of our keynote speakers, and I'll get to interview him. So
yes, exactly.
I'm plotting my revenge as we speak.
Exactly. So with that, thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you.